sometimes it can feel good to know that you're not the only one experiencing this.
Fidgeting, is that an adaptive strategy, or is that something that is just as bad as being distracted?
My authentic self, that includes my ADHD, is part of the reason for my success rather than something that I'm constantly fighting against.
Basically going from feeling like career success was down to luck to feeling like the choices that you made created the success.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Research Recap. Today, we're going to be chatting with you about something that we've been getting a lot of questions about. So we figured, let's go dive into the research. We sent the wonderful Taylor looking for these papers to see what we could find in finances and financial decision making. We found a couple of different things, so we're going to go on a little bit of a journey here today, but we're going to end with a really lovely paper that's going to wrap it all up for us and sort of start to explain some of the things that we've been thinking about. Are you ready, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm ready to dig into this a little bit.
Awesome. So the first paper is from this year. It's called Financial Decision Making Community in a Sample of Adults with and Without Current Symptoms being the operative word here, of ADHD. And basically what they wanted to know was they wanted to look at the impact of symptoms of ADHD on impulsive buying and the use of financial decision styles, both positive and negative, as well as the influence of personality, which we'll get into how they did that, symptoms of depression, and demographics in general on the association between ADHD and financial decision making, aka are we having struggles with finances because we're ADHD, or is it more of a personality thing? So how did they do this?
We've got a community sample of almost 1,300 participants, skewed slightly female. There's about 700 females to almost 600 males. Wow, that's quite an age range. 18 to 93, but
Wow.
our mean here is about 48 years old. So a pretty general person. It's all self-report, right? So they gave them a bunch of questionnaires, a depression questionnaire, a financial decision-making style questionnaire. What else do we have? Oh, there was an impulse buying questionnaire. And then I got really excited when I read this. They measured personality using the Big Five personality test, which I asked Sky if she knew that one just to see, never really know where the knowledge lines up, right? Where did you learn about it? Just curious.
So I studied psychology in university. Yeah. So I studied personality as a paper, and we learned about a lot of different types of tests. The biggest one was the Big Five personality test because it is the one that people use in academia the most. So you might have heard about Myers-Briggs and other things, but the one that's sort of the most researched is the Big Five.
Highest validation or whatever you would say.
Exactly, yeah. Not as fun, but the highest validation. And if you want to remember the different pieces, using the term ocean, people use that word. So it's openness, conscientiousness, let's see if I can remember it, extroversion, agreeableness. Is it agreeableness and neuroticism? I think those are the things. Yep. Okay, good.
If you're interested, you can take this test sort of online. It was really interesting. It was the first time I started to question am I actually neurotic? Is that a thing that I can accept about myself? This is a really awesome test, which is why it asks you different sorts of questions than the other ones, which is why I got excited to see that's how they measured personality in this paper. Anyway, so just going to wrap up the methods real quick. They had 4 subgroups of their population. So ADHD group, adult only ADHD group, so it means symptoms weren't present in childhood, sub-threshold ADHD group.
I guess the question that I have is they mentioned specifically this idea of financial decision styles. So Can you take me through what some of those decision styles were?
Yeah, so the financial decision styles questionnaire looks at 5 different styles. So it asks you a bunch of questions and then you rate it strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then the 5 styles are rational decision style, evaluating options before making a decision. Intuitive decision style, relying on feelings and emotions when making a decision. Dependent decision style, requiring the advice of others when making a decision. And an avoidant decision style, avoiding or postponing making a decision. Oh, there's one more. Spontaneous decision style, being impulsive when making a decision.
Which, we'll find out in a second. But yeah, when I saw the spontaneous one, I was like, oh, too real. Very, very real. Yeah, which one do you think?
So I would consider myself an intuitive decision style. But if I'm having an emotional episode, I don't necessarily trust how I'm feeling. And so then I might lean more into like, God forbid, an avoidant decision style, maybe a dependent, I might depend on my husband a little bit to help me make a decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. What about you?
That was a good question. So there's avoidant, dependent, intuitive, and impulsive. Is there one I'm missing?
And rational.
So, obviously I'd love to be rational, but when I'm not, I would say I probably swing between rational and impulsive. So most of the time I'll sort of err on the side of actually being quite cautious spending money. But then sometimes if I'm in a position where like something's gone really well or I need something, I'll just be like, just buy the thing that I need. Like I don't really want to have this huge like pros and cons list about it. So I sort of go between those two.
Honestly, a lot of us with ADHD have very busy brains. So we can both be having rational like thoughts going through, evaluating those rational thoughts while also trying to field some of those more impulsive or like other feelings-based, emotions-based thoughts. So like both can be happening like actually at the same time. I didn't even consider mentioning that I make rational decisions because I hope that to be self-evident.
I think it is. Thank you. But yeah, it is interesting. I think there is a little bit of going between them that would be happening. So yeah, for those of you at home, follow along. Let us know what style are you, and then we'll go into the results. So what did they find when they asked their group?
So I think the easiest way to say this is they found a lot of relationships with like specific dimensions of personality and like impulse spending behaviors, but the association between the impulse spending and the ADHD symptoms specifically went away when accounting for those additional variables. So like when you take into account personality, symptoms of depression, your demographics, like the relationship,
it wasn't significant.
Yeah. The amount that your ADHD symptoms impact your impulse spending actually sort of disappeared. Yeah. Well, it became less significant, I should say.
Yeah, which basically means that from their perspective, what they found was that, yes, ADHD groups reported significantly more impulse buying and were more likely to use an avoidant or spontaneous decision style, less often saving money. But if you then controlled for if you're the kind of person who's struggling with depression or you're highly maybe neurotic or something like that, then it felt like those elements were overtaking ADHD in terms of being significant parts of why this person might be having these struggles.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because there's such a relationship in our minds with ADHD and impulse spending. But yeah, I mean, the research suggests that not all of us struggle with that.
Yeah. Or if we do struggle with it, it might be emotional, might be something else.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that it probably also tracks that this behavior changes over the lifetime, as any ADHD symptom might, or I hesitate to call it a symptom, but it's more like a behavior. It's like, what is it? What do we call it?
They called it a symptom.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm giving giving you permission. Yeah, I agree. But I also think, and the reason I'm saying this now is it's going to become more important later on in this podcast. Correlation does not equal causation. This is a correlation study. And one of the great things, that they've done, which is wonderful, we love it, is that they have controlled. They've had some controls. But, if we were to really get a sense of this, we'd want to be looking at like a randomized controlled trial, experimental models, sort of something along those lines to really get a sense of it. So this is kind of giving us a broad sweep, but there were definitely some limitations, and they mentioned some of them at the end as well. Most notably, this group of people have symptoms of ADHD. They did a questionnaire. They didn't actually get diagnosed with ADHD, which we're always pointing out, but it's very worth mentioning. Were there any other limitations you wanted to mention?
I mean, there's a lot of really common ones in here. The results might not be highly generalizable because it's a clinical ADHD population, presumably. Yeah, I mean, it says like their findings sort of go along with other findings in this area, but they didn't control for comorbidities at all, the use of medication at all, which they mention, although they did ask. It's almost like an exploratory study, sort of like the beginning. Do we study this more? Is it worth it?
Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah.
There weren't enough papers on this.
Yeah, we were really surprised.
It was all on ADHD and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, for those of you who are curious, 70%, I would say, of all the papers we found were on ADHD and entrepreneurship? More,
I think, yeah.
And so this idea that ADHD people struggle with finances seems crazy because it feels so much of a part of the discussions that we have in our little, enclave of neurodiverse conversation. But it is maybe more new when it comes to research. So yeah, this was very much we should do more testing on this. So we went and found another paper to talk about, a paper that had done this similarly correlational style research with a wider group of participants.
Much wider.
Yeah, exactly. Much wider. And for those of you who've been following this podcast for a while, you might be unsurprised to find out that we found that paper in Sweden. I will say before we talk about this paper in detail, there are some elements of it that we are not going to discuss because it isn't relevant to this conversation as much. So I want to give a trigger warning to anybody who does decide to go into this paper in more detail and sort of look at that research. If you do, then just remember that what I said before still applies. This is all correlational research, especially in a big paper. There is a lot of opportunity for things to correlate but not cause, or to be on a population level but not on an individual level. So just keep that in mind. Hello, everyone. Just a reminder that if you are an overwhelmed professional who has been late diagnosed with ADHD and you know you need to get focused and balanced, we have the support for you. We've got that 6-week course. We've already got people signing up. So make sure you don't miss out. You're going to have to go ahead and click on interested ASAP. So just email me and I'll send you all of the details. The truth is, so many people come to me and they say, I'm overwhelmed, but I don't want to work with you because I need to get everything sorted first. We are the place that will get things sorted for you. We're not going to give you extra work. We're going to reduce the work that you have to do. It's going to be fun. It's going to be easy. It's going to feel great. I've seen people go from I can't get enough sleep to I'm feeling really confident. It's really helping me with my sleep. I'm showing up more present for my family, for my work. I'm getting things done. So 100%, if you feel like you need that support, just reach out. Just say that you're interested and we'll send you those details. So the next paper we looked at was essentially focusing on the idea of ADHD and financial distress. And, this comes from psychological sciences. And what they were looking at was a big, big population of Swedish people. And what we were particularly interested in was their relationship between ADHD and financial distress, because, we wanted to see if another study could back up what the previous study we just talked about was talking about. So Sarah, do you want to take us through how they did this study?
Oh, yeah, no big deal. So first they took the mental health data collected from the entire Swedish population. That's 11.55 million people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then they sort of checked it against a random sample of data from like a credit and default study. That sample was almost 190,000 people from 2002 to 2015. Essentially, they were trying to identify common financial themes and outcomes throughout like the adulthood period to see if they could find anything that kept popping up across the ADHD population specifically.
Yeah. And so they were looking at ADHD, credit, and financial behavior, and very particular financial behaviors. Did they have any specific examples of that kind of negative behavior? Here I can see unpaid alimony, unpaid TV license fee, decision to impound,
Higher demand for credit.
higher demand for credit, unpaid tax, road tax, bankruptcy, and unpaid government debt as well. So lots of things not being paid.
They go on to say that because the elderly population wasn't really diagnosed with ADHD, they don't actually have information from that time period to look at. So what did they call it? Late life ADHD.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So basically, they wanted to measure the extent of financial distress and hardship amongst adults diagnosed with ADHD. And to cut a long story short, they found it. They definitely found that, when adjusting for income, education, psychiatric and health comorbidities, substance use, et cetera, they found that people were still having that relationship between financial distress and ADHD. Do you want to take us into some more of the kind of details of the financial distress people were experiencing, Sarah?
So basically, when they're looking at all of the people, what they observe is that adolescents and adults with ADHD tend to suffer from things like persistent and pervasive functional impairment, things like poor performance academically, or what they call vocational underachievement, which just means like taking a lesser job than you're capable of. How dare you? Things like dropout rates, job performance, difficulty sustaining employment. That feels
pointed.
Yeah. Us both with our like dozen careers between.
Yeah. And they also mentioned lower wages than their peers as well.
Yeah, I was skimming another study as I was deciding what we were going to talk about, and it was looking at things like that, actually, lower wages than compared to our neurotypical peers, similar like outcomes at specific ages.
Yeah.
But again, it was a much lower study than this one, much smaller sample.
Yeah. They also found that young adults were more reliant financially on both their parents and social services. They earned more than $600,000 less, that was US dollars, across their lifetimes. And they found that hyperactive and impulsive ADHD was associated with higher debt, higher interest rate borrowing, late payments as well. So yeah, I think the reason we're talking about this, even though, like we said, the study is a little bit difficult to go through, is because sometimes it can feel good to know that you're not the only one experiencing this. If you have ADHD and you are struggling with financial issues of various kinds, there is some evidence, at least correlationally, to suggest that you are not alone and that this may in fact be an ADHD thing that we all experience, at least without, the strategies and supports as well, which is something that we are starting to look into much more strongly at Unconventional Organization because people are talking about it more at the moment and looking for those solutions.
Not to let the neuroticism out of the bag, but I also just want to point out that while this episode is super focused on like the financial aspects of impulsivity, well, really we were trying to focus on finances, but then we wound up focusing on impulsivity. That can manifest in different other behaviors, what we eat, where we choose to like spend our time physically or mentally.
Yeah.
This is certainly not the only place we struggle with impulsivity either.
No, that's a really, really good point. And yeah, I think it's good to know that you're not alone. And hopefully, as we go through, if you do look at our articles and follow with us on the website, keep an eye out, because I'm hoping to start writing some strategies to help a little bit with this finance focus, because, it is another area, like you said, Sarah, of impulsiveness. And so it has a lot of struggles, but also there are some strategies to kind of start with at least. Okay, so shall we talk about the last study, which was a great study to pull, Sarah, because it goes into a little bit more of the complexity, both positive and negative. We're talking about a thematic analysis qualitative study where we get to, in some ways, sit back a little bit and let the people who were in the study share their experiences and kind of take us through to, wrap up this conversation about finance, which I think is really cool. So I'm excited to get into it. So essentially, this paper was looking at paradoxical career strengths and successes of adults with ADHD. It was a thematic analysis from the Journal of Work Applied Management, and it had two research questions, which was one, how do ADHDers construct self-identified strengths to explain career success stories during a strength-focused interview process? Because we can be very successful as well, and we can, be financially successful too. And then to what extent do ADHDers articulate career success achieved in spite of their ADHD or because of it? So take us through how they did this, Sarah. What was the methods?
So this is really awesome to read, and it actually gave me some new ideas for coaching, but let's talk about it. So a pretty small sample, as you would expect for something of this caliber. 17, they were all over 25. 32 originally expressed interest, but dropped out probably for
ADHD reasons.
ADHD reasons, probably. Pretty even split between men and female. Only 2 of their sample were diagnosed in childhood. Everybody else was diagnosed in mid to late adulthood, which I felt the need to note.
Yeah, definitely.
This study was done in the UK, which I think is important in the context of that statement.
Mm-hmm. We've been all over the world today.
So they did a semi-structured interview, 60 to 90 minutes. It was always the same person doing the interview. Basically, they could choose whatever format felt the best for them. In person, telephone, virtual, like Zoom or whatever. They were allowing you to fill out your demographics forms verbally over the phone with someone. They really did a lot to try to be accessible and accommodating to the people who were doing the study.
We love that. That's so awesome.
Yeah. And I skipped this part a little bit, but since they're focusing on careers, they did a really great job of getting a wide variety of careers represented. So they had 2 academics, 2 sales professionals, 2 creative directors or business owners, 2 charity workers, 2 teachers, a social entrepreneur, an artist, police inspector, a journalist, a project manager, a property developer, and a healthcare professional.
Wow, that's cool.
In order to participate in this study, they all had to agree to this statement. I feel successful in my career.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to mention.
Yeah, I think so too. Just out of interest, that's also pretty much the statement you had to agree with to be a guest on the podcast recently. We did kind of a very similar thing. That's so funny. So what did they find? Like, there was different thematic focuses. So, they had themes, which were spontaneity, linking ideas, a different perspective, empathy, a sense of fairness and justice, hyperfocus, physical and mental energy, a sense of humor, altruism, and resilience. But I would love it, Sarah, if you could go into it a little bit more detail, how these kinds of, we won't be able to go through all of them. I highly recommend you read these studies. They're always such a good time. But do you want to take us through some of your favorites, really, in terms of what they found?
We could talk about the main themes real quick. So the 2 main themes that they found in the stories that people shared with them were the paradoxical nature of strengths and career success as an evolving narrative.
Yeah, I'm looking at that table right now. They said hard-won success despite ADHD, and then authentic success because of ADHD, which I thought was so lovely because I definitely feel like I'm in the second place now, which is authentic success because of ADHD. And I feel so amazingly grateful to have that because I know how difficult that can be.
That's a little bit further down there, but that's related to the career success as an evolving narrative. That's exactly the second one. Basically going from feeling like career success was down to luck to feeling like the choices that you made like created the success.
Yeah.
You know, the ability to sort of take some of those impulsive risks or, you know, not sort of think too long about things. Those were all
helpful in the end.
Yeah. They also did sort of talk a little bit about sporadic success. I feel like a lot of people could relate to that as well. Rather than having it be like a normal slope, it's sort of more like, we get a little bit and then we're on a balcony a little bit and then we're going up a little bit more and then we're just going to...
And then we got distracted.
We're looking at the sunrise. No, but I really want to talk about the paradoxical strengths thing because it's sort of the same conversation as we had when we were talking about hyperfocus as a blessing and a curse. You know, it can be good.
Yeah.
So not only did they sort of recognize some of these strengths, they also asked them how they perceived these strengths. So not just like, what do you notice, but like also, how do you feel about it? And so that's how they came up with that list. Things like empathy and connecting with people.
So like Sarah mentioned, there was two core themes. We had the paradoxical nature of strengths, which was the idea of core strengths, strengths as adaptive strategies, and then overplayed strengths. And then we had the idea of career success as an evolving narrative, which was the idea of hard-won success despite your ADHD or authentic success because of your ADHD. I want to go and find some of those quotes, particularly about that idea of ADHD career success, because I think it's particularly interesting. At least I found it very interesting to see what was going on. So one of the things that they found, and they've got a really nice little model there for anybody who wants to go and find it, is that when they were focusing on this idea of career success, they mentioned the idea of hard-won success before their diagnosis. So they had Michael B., who was now a founder of an objectively successful, supported social enterprise, who was sort of like, oh yeah, I guess I am successful. I don't feel successful, partially because of how hard-won that success was. And I thought that was super interesting to discuss because I've spoken to some very successful people with ADHD on the podcast who I think, you know, you have expressed similar thoughts. And then someone called Jo who had multiple academic publications to her name, which, I mean, does that make you feel more or less insecure? I mean, academics, let us know. But she talked about this idea of success, saying, you know, putting something down on paper that says I've achieved doesn't necessarily equate with a feeling of achievement in myself. A lot of it has to do with imposter syndrome, thinking about how much did I have to go through to achieve this. I definitely relate. I had a bit of burnout after my master's thesis and, you know, had to take some time off and go do something else and then come back. I think a lot of people relate to that idea of, you know, achievement, but at what cost, especially with ADHD. But then, you know, they did also talk about this idea of, you know, getting a diagnosis and then feeling like their success is either because of or in spite of their ADHD. So this idea of being themselves and having that be a part of their ADHD, sort of internalizing their ADHD and then internalizing their success as well, which is really cool. So
again, not just focusing on like what they're asking about, but also like how the person interprets that.
Yeah, exactly, which is great. And the wonderful thing about these kind of analyses, Kate talked about a bit of self-awareness, you know, thinking about being proud of what she's done, having less shame there. And then Simon talked about, you know, my life would have been very different if I'd had the diagnosis, but also understanding, you know, somebody called David mentioned, I'm more forgiving of the fact that it's more important to always have things that are stimulating enough to keep me going. The paradox is that if you're ADHD, the most responsible thing to do is to make sure that you're stimulated. So getting a sense of how to work with ADHD. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Kate also mentioned it's incredible over the years. It can be a rocky ride, but if you can really harness the positive attributes about your ADHD, about yourself, and then make it happen, it's really magical. It's just so meaningful being able to do that kind of thing. So I think it's a nice ending to this conversation, this idea that understanding your ADHD and learning about how to work with your ADHD can, at least according to the stories in this research paper, start to feel very meaningful and very magical. And you're bringing in this idea of my authentic self that includes my ADHD is part of the reason for my success rather than something that I'm constantly fighting against. So it's definitely something that I think I've only started to experience very recently and not even all the time. But it's definitely something I want to continue to try to get to using, strategies and emotional support as well. And something that, I hope to be able to help other people to get to because I think it's a really good place to be.
They even talk about it sort of earlier when they're listing like specific things like fidgeting. Is that an adaptive strategy or is that something that is just as bad as being distracted? How we label these things is almost just as important. I could get really down on myself for having to like have a reminder to take my meds at the same time every day. Or I could just see it as like a very reliable time of day. I always know where I'm going to at least be traveling to at that time of day. And like having some kind of consistency can be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. It is that reframing. And, it brings in space for the conversation about the benefits and the strengths of ADHD. I mean, this whole podcast would be a lot harder, I think, if we weren't ADHD because we wouldn't be able to come up with so many different ways of thinking about things and pattern match potentially as many pieces together and, all those kinds of creative thinking, creative problem solving strengths that you find in the research when you look at ADHD. Yeah, it's a very complex conversation, but it is interesting. And, to bring it back to the finance conversation, one of the interesting things about this is the idea of ADHD and finance is very, it hasn't been widely studied. And so we're talking a lot about the negatives, and obviously there are a lot of negatives, but there might also be some positives, that we haven't looked into yet around being able to go out there and, if people are entrepreneurial, they're self-employed, being able to make money, doing creative things. There's other things around, being able to get to the top of a career and hyper-focus and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm not to say that everybody has to be successful. That is not at all what we're saying here at all, or that is what success even looks like. As Sarah laughed about this idea of vocational careers and, oh, how terrible you took a career that wasn't as high as it could have been. But it is worth just sort of adding a layer of complexity to the conversation. And I think a good qualitative study always manages to do that, which is, what we love about them. Awesome. So that is everything for today. Really, really interesting papers. And yeah, thanks, Sarah, for pulling those as well. And thanks to Taylor for finding all of those papers for us. I'm very excited to continue to dive into this idea of ADHD and finance and see where it leads us. Definitely feel free to reach out if you have any ideas or if you have any papers that you want to recommend. Otherwise, that is all for this week. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening, everyone. And a big thank you to Adam for making us sound great and Anastasia for making us look great. We couldn't do it without you.
And if you're looking for any of the references to the papers that we discussed, head on over to our show notes page because I always bring the receipts.
Plus, if you want to find out more about us or any more deep diving into what we're doing, you can find us on Substack. That's where the community is. That's where we're chatting. And you can see all of the fun and exciting things that we are bringing to the table.
Thanks for being here.